Every Christmas for 15 years, I waited for an invitation that never came. No card, no call, not even a text. My parents always had a reason. "Oh, you're always so busy, dear," or "We thought you were traveling again." After the 5th year, I stopped pretending to believe them. After the 10th, I stopped pretending it didn't hurt. But this year, things were different. I posted 3 photos on my private Instagram, a fire crackling in the stone hearth snow, falling beyond the glass, and a mug of peppermint cocoa resting on the windowsill. The caption read, "My first quiet Christmas." 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. "Mom, perfect, Daniel and Ella will move in for the holidays. The baby needs mountain air." Another message followed before I could even blink. "Will arrive Friday. The locksmith is already scheduled." I stared at the screen as the peppermint turned bitter on my tongue. The flames snapped in the fireplace. Outside, the snow fell in thick, lazy sheets, muting the world into stillness. I'd bought this cabin for that silence, for the promise of peace I'd never had growing up in the coal house. And now that silence was being invaded by a few words typed from a phone miles away. I set the mug down and read the text again, slower this time, like maybe the meaning would change if I gave it enough air. It didn't. They weren't asking. They were informing me. The house I had purchased, furnished and decorated by myself, had just been claimed as a family asset. I should have seen it coming. Every December of my adult life had been a variation of the same theme: exclusion disguised as forgetfulness. My mother was a master of polite cruelty. "Oh, sweetheart, we didn't think you'd want to make the long drive. You work so hard, you deserve a quiet weekend." And my father would chime in with the same patronizing tone. "We'll have something small, just the immediate family." Immediate family. Somehow that phrase had never included me. I remember one year vividly. I was 23, just out of grad school, renting a studio the size of a closet. I sent Mom a photo of the little wreath I'd hung on my door, hoping she'd notice the effort. Her reply came hours later, a group picture from the Cole Christmas Eve dinner. The caption read, "All together again." Except we weren't. I was never in those photos, but they always tagged me anyway, as if my name could make up for my absence. I used to make excuses for them. I told myself they were busy, distracted, overwhelmed by Daniel's success. He was the golden child, the lawyer, the husband, the soon-to-be father. His trophies had their own shelf in the den. Mine were in boxes under the basement stairs. It took me years to understand that the forgetting wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. A tradition almost. And traditions die hard in my family. The hum of the wind outside pulled me back to the present. My phone screen still glowed those messages like intruders in the warm light of the room. Perfect. "Daniel and Ella will move in." My jaw clenched. Move in? They didn't even say visit. No question mark. No would you mind, just a declaration. It was the same tone Mom used when she assigned chores when I was 12, expecting compliance, not consent. I leaned back in the armchair and looked around my living room. The A-frame ceilings, the wide windows framing the snowy woods, the scent of pine and wood smoke. Silverwood Retreat, that's what I'd named it on the deed. The place had once been a run-down bed and breakfast, abandoned for years. I'd spent the last 6 months renovating it myself on weekends, refinishing the floors, repainting the walls, building furniture that actually fit my taste instead of my family's expectations. Every beam, every nail, every brushstroke was mine. It wasn't just a house. It was the first space in my life that didn't echo with someone else's authority. And now, even from miles away, they wanted to reclaim it. I could almost hear Mom's voice in my head, bright and falsely sweet. "We'll bring the turkey, dear. You don't have to lift a finger." Translation: "We're taking over." I stood up, pacing to the window. The reflection in the glass caught me off guard, my own face, lit by the orange glow of the fire. I looked calm, but my heart thudded against my ribs. The snow outside fell heavier, covering the gravel drive in a white sheet. My phone buzzed again. A new message from Dad. "We'll discuss logistics when we arrive. It'll be a full house. Be useful. be useful. That phrase, sharp cold, was the soundtrack of my childhood. Useful meant obedient. It meant quiet. It meant invisible. I closed my eyes. For a long moment, I just listened to the wind, the ticking of the old wall clock, the faint pop of the fire. Then I opened them again. The fear that had risen in my throat dissolved into something steadier. Defiance, maybe. Or clarity. I picked up the phone, scrolled to the family chat, and hovered over the keyboard. My fingers shook once before I typed 3 words. No, not possible. I didn't send it. Not yet. I just let it sit there, glowing blue against the white screen. Memories crowded in, uninvited. The Christmas I spent alone in a sublet apartment eating Chinese takeout and watching snow fall through a cracked window. The year they claimed they were in Florida but posted photos from their home fireplace instead. The birthdays, skipped the calls, ignored the years I learned to stop expecting anything at all. The silence had once been painful. Now it was sacred. I set the phone down again untouched. Let them text. Let them plan. They would learn soon enough that my house wasn't theirs to take. I'd built this retreat for myself for the version of me that had been erased, dismissed, rewritten as an afterthought. I didn't owe them hospitality. I didn't owe them forgiveness. The fire cracked louder, sending a wave of heat through the room. I wrapped the blanket tighter around my shoulders and took a slow sip of peppermint cocoa. The taste steadied me. It reminded me of everything I'd built in silence, my career, my independence, my peace. They could keep their cinnamon sticks and their perfect family portraits. Peppermint was mine. Outside, the snow deepened. My car parked near the trees was already half buried. The woods stretched endlessly beyond the deck, soft and quiet and mine. I looked out into the white expanse and whispered, "Not this year." My breath fogged the glass, a faint halo of warmth against the cold. For years they had forgotten me. This year they would remember, but not the way they expected. Somewhere in the distance, faint and muffled through the snow, a car engine rumbled down the mountain road. I turned toward the sound, my pulse quickening. It faded again into silence. I smiled to myself. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. The morning after the text, the mountain was quiet again, but the silence felt different. I brewed coffee and watched the steam curl against the frost on the window. My phone sat face down on the counter as if turning it over might summon another intrusion. I took a sip and scrolled through my email. Buried between work updates and newsletters was one from my company's HR department. Happy holidays from Redwood Media. Family is everything this season. I almost laughed out loud. Not for everyone, I muttered. The bitterness in my voice startled me. Outside, the snow shimmered under the early sun, soft and deceptive. It looked peaceful, but I knew how quiet things could still hurt. My mind drifted backward to another morning, years ago when I was 10, and still thought Christmas meant belonging. I could see it clearly, the kitchen warm, with the smell of maple syrup, my mother at the stove shaping pancake batter into a perfect D for Daniel. He was 12, then the family's golden boy, the center of every orbit. I sat at the counter with an empty plate, waiting for her to notice me. "Can I help decorate the tree after breakfast?" I asked. She didn't look up. "Later, sweetheart. Let's get your brother fed before his big game." By the time the plates were cleared, the house was already buzzing with Daniel's teammates, arriving, my father laughing too loudly, my mother fussing over snacks. When I walked into the living room that night, the tree sparkled, every ornament perfectly placed, except for the one I'd made in art class. My little felt star lay forgotten on the kitchen counter next to the crumbs of Daniel's pancakes. I had stared at it for a long time before carrying it to my room. That was the first year I realized being part of this family meant being part of the background. It only got worse as I got older. Every December became a rehearsal of absence. The family photo on the mantel changed with each year, different outfits, newer furniture, but always the same 3 smiles without me. They sent those photos out as holiday cards embossed with "From the Cole family." I used to joke that maybe they meant the extended family, that perhaps my name was implied. Eventually, I stopped asking for explanations. I learned to fill the space they left behind. I bought myself gifts, wrote from Santa on the tags, and acted like the laughter from downstairs didn't reach my room. I told myself I was independent. I told myself I was above needing them. But the truth was, I was just trained to expect exclusion. I'd been edited out so many times I started believing that was my place. A gust of wind rattled the window pane, pulling me back to the present. I looked around my cabin. My clean wooden walls, the pine beams catching the morning light, the faint hum of the heater. Every inch of this house was a rebellion against that old feeling. Still, their words from yesterday echoed in my head. "We'll arrive Friday. The locksmith is already scheduled." They didn't ask, they decided. I stepped outside onto the deck. The air bit at my cheeks, sharp and clear. The snow stretched endlessly, glittering like sugar. Somewhere in that stillness, I realized how much I'd built this peace for myself. I'd spent years surviving other people's noise. Now I'd built a silence that belonged entirely to me. The phone buzzed inside. I froze. For a moment I considered ignoring it, but curiosity won. The screen flashed with a name that made me exhale in relief: Nana May. Evie darling, her voice crackled through the line, bright and rough as gravel. "I saw your pictures. That cabin looks like heaven itself." "It is," I said. Or it was until Mom decided it's our new family lodge. Nana let out a sound halfway between a laugh and a snort. "Oh, she remembers you now that there's property involved." I laughed, but it caught in my throat. "They're serious, Nana. They're bringing the baby stuff a locksmith like I'm supposed to make room for all of them." "You listen to me," she said, her tone sharpening. "They'll try to turn your peace into a stage again. Don't let them. You earned that roof. You owe them nothing." Her words hung there steady and warm. I looked around the room, the polished wood floors, the framed photo of the valley, the mug still steaming on the counter. For once, I didn't feel like a child in a fight. I felt like an adult defending her ground. "I'm not 10 anymore," I said quietly. "Then act like it, darling," she replied. "And remember what I told you years ago. Paper beats blood in court." When we hung up, I stood there a long time listening to the wind moving through the pines. Paper beats blood. The phrase slid into my mind like a key into a lock. For the first time, I understood exactly what she meant. Family may claim love, but love without respect is just ownership. I spent the afternoon walking the perimeter of my property, boots crunching in the snow. The mountains loomed distant and blue. Every breath of cold air cleared my head a little more. They had erased me for years, one Christmas at a time. I wasn't going to let them rewrite this one. Back inside, I made peppermint cocoa, the ritual I'd built for myself. It wasn't cinnamon or nutmeg, the scents that filled my parents' perfect home. It was sharp, clean mine. As I stirred the mug, I opened my laptop and created a new folder titled Family Boundaries. Inside, I typed the first entry, Rule Hashone. No entry without written invitation. I paused, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The act felt absurdly formal, but it also felt right. If they wanted to treat me like a stranger, then I'd treat them like one through contracts, not conversation. The afternoon light dimmed, early turning gold to gray. I sat on the couch and let the fire warm my face. My phone pinged again, a message from Daniel. I stared at it until the preview disappeared. I didn't open it. Whatever guilt he was trying to press would have to find someone else. As dusk settled, I poured another cup of cocoa and looked at the empty guest rooms upstairs. When I'd first bought the cabin, I'd imagined filling those rooms with people who actually wanted to be there, friends, maybe laughter. Not a family invasion disguised as Christmas. I thought of all those years when I would have given anything just to be invited. Now I finally had space, warmth, and peace, and I wanted them as far from it as possible. The irony wasn't lost on me. Maybe that was the lesson. Sometimes you have to stop waiting at the door to realize you can build your own. Outside, the wind had quieted. I locked every door, hearing the click echo through the still house. It wasn't fear this time, it was control. It was the sound of deciding who was allowed in and who wasn't. Before bed, I called Nana again just to say goodnight. She didn't pick up, but her voicemail greeted me the same way it always had. This is the Queen herself. Leave your royal message. I smiled, listening to it twice before hanging up. When I lay down, the silence wasn't heavy like it used to be. It was clean, almost gentle. I stared at the ceiling beams and whispered to myself, "This year, I won't be erased." The fire burned low, painting gold on the wooden walls. Outside snow fell again, soft and endless. For once I didn't dread the quiet. I belonged to it, and it belonged to me. The first warning came on Thursday morning, a full day before they were supposed to arrive. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when I saw the email from an address I didn't recognize. Locksmith appointment confirmed for Friday 9:30 a.m. My stomach dropped. The note was brief, almost cheerful, signed by Cole Family Residence Management. The audacity made me laugh out loud, sharp and humorless. I wasn't even on the CC line. I called the number listed and a man answered. "Mountain Lock and Key. This is Trent." "Yes. Hi," I said, forcing calm. "Someone scheduled a service at Silverwood Retreat for tomorrow morning. That's my property. I didn't authorize it." A pause. "Huh. The guy who booked it said he was your dad. Said you'd lost the keys." "He lied," I said, voice clipped. "Cancel the appointment. If anyone shows up, it'll be reported as trespassing." Trent exhaled uneasy. "Understood, ma'am. I'll take care of it." When I hung up, my hands were shaking. They weren't just pushing boundaries, they were bulldozing them. I sat down at the dining table, the morning light spilling across the wood, and opened my laptop. I began writing an email, not to them but to myself. Date December 22. Subject documentation log. Beneath it I typed every detail: the fake booking, the time, the company's name. I added screenshots, receipts, copies. It felt obsessive but also strangely grounding. Paper beats blood. By noon, the anxiety had shifted into purpose. I made a grocery list, drove into the small town below the ridge, and stopped by the sheriff's office. The receptionist, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes, looked up. "Morning. What can I help you with?" "I'd like to file a precautionary notice," I said. "There's a chance my family might try to enter my property without permission." Her brows lifted slightly. "Are you expecting trouble?" "I'm expecting entitlement," I said. "And that's usually worse." She nodded slowly. "We get that more often than you'd think." She handed me a short form. "Write down your address, the names of the individuals, and mark it informational. If they show up, we'll already have context." When I left, the form felt heavier than it should have. Not fear evidence. At the grocery store, the small-town warmth almost startled me. The cashier, a man in his 50s, smiled when he saw my basket filled with flour, cocoa powder, and candles. "Stocking up for the storm." "Something like that," I said. "Well, welcome to High Ridge," he said, scanning each item. "It's quiet up here, but folks take care of their own." The words lingered. Their own. I wanted to believe I could be one of them. That night I cooked for myself, an actual meal, not takeout. The scent of rosemary filled the air as snow began to fall again, thick and silent. I sat by the window, eating slowly, watching the flakes swirl past the deck. My phone lay face up on the table, dark for hours. Then it buzzed. A text from Daniel. "Mom says we'll be there around noon tomorrow. We're bringing Ella's things and the baby's crib. Please have the downstairs cleared." I stared at the message, my fork suspended in midair. Not a question, not even a pretense of asking, just a command. Another ping followed seconds later, a picture of a U-Haul half-loaded with boxes. The caption, "We're making it festive." I turned the phone over. I didn't reply. The next morning I woke before sunrise, the sky still a deep blue. My breath fogged in the cold air as I stood by the fireplace waiting for the coffee to finish brewing. The deck outside was buried in snow, untouched. It looked peaceful again, but I'd stopped trusting appearances. At 8:00 a.m., I called my grandmother. They're on their way, I said, my voice shaking with restrained anger. Of course they are, Nana May said dryly. Vultures don't stay grounded long. I went to the sheriff, I told her. Filed something preemptive. Good girl, you'll thank yourself later. I'm tired, Nana. I know, honey, she said softly. But tired doesn't mean defeated. Remember, they've had practice manipulating you your whole life. You're just learning to fight back. You'll get better at it. Her words steadied me. When we hung up, I made a plan. I set up my phone cameras to record the driveway and porch. I adjusted the angles until every inch of the entrance was visible. I wasn't sure yet what I'd do if they showed up, but I knew I'd have proof. The hours passed painfully slow. I vacuumed, rearranged furniture, anything to stay busy. The sound of the wind outside made me flinch each time it changed pitch. Around 11, the tension peaked. I thought I heard tires crunching on the snow-covered drive. I went to the window. Nothing. Just the long, empty stretch of white. By noon, there was still no sign of them. For a fleeting moment, I let myself hope they'd changed their minds. Maybe they'd realized how wrong it was. Maybe the locksmith canceled and they gave up. At 12:30, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. This is Trent from Mountain Lock and Key again. Just wanted to confirm you were right to cancel. Someone showed up this morning saying they were the homeowners. I told them you'd already called. They were angry, but they left. My pulse thundered. Did they say anything? I typed quickly. Yeah, he replied. The guy your dad, I guess, said he'd handle it personally. Sorry for the mess, ma'am. Handle it personally. The phrase sat like a stone in my chest. I sat on the couch, staring into the fire. There was no relief, no peace, just the certainty that something worse was coming. They'd tried the polite route, then the professional one. Next would be the personal invasion. The snow outside glittered under the pale light, almost mocking in its stillness. By late afternoon, I started moving through the house with purpose. I double-checked the locks, turned on the exterior motion lights, and lit a single candle in the kitchen. It flickered against the window, a small, defiant glow in the darkening cold. At 6:15, the power flickered, once, twice, then held. I stared at the ceiling, my breath caught. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it wasn't. When I finally went to bed, exhaustion felt like armor. I set my phone to vibrate the cameras to notify on motion. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the heater. I lay there staring into the dark, whispering to myself the same line over and over until I believed it. They can't erase me anymore. They can't come in. Outside, the snow kept falling, each flake a tiny boundary laid carefully between me and them. The first sound was the crunch of tires on snow. It was slow, deliberate, not the random drift of a lost driver. I froze at the window, coffee mug halfway to my lips. The road leading up to Silverwood was narrow, one way in and one way out. I watched as two vehicles appeared through the pines, a white SUV followed by a smaller van. My heart started beating in my throat. They'd actually done it. The SUV stopped in front of the porch. My father got out first, his coat immaculate, his expression the same tight mix of authority and irritation he'd worn my whole life. Behind him, my mother stepped out, adjusting her fur-lined hood like she was arriving at a weekend spa. Then came Daniel, carrying a cardboard box labeled nursery, and Ella, visibly pregnant, clutching a thermos and looking like she wanted to be anywhere but there. The van door slid open, and a man in overalls climbed out, holding a metal toolbox. My pulse quickened. The locksmith. For a moment, I couldn't move. It was surreal watching them unload like they were on vacation, like my home was some rental they'd booked online. My mother's laughter carried faintly through the cold air. "Oh, Richard, look at the view. Isn't it perfect for the baby? Perfect?" I turned away from the window and exhaled through my nose, steadying myself. I wasn't a child anymore. This wasn't a game of endurance. This was trespassing. The doorbell rang, a bright digital chime that echoed through the cabin. I picked up my phone, opened the camera app, linked to the porch feed, and pressed record. Then I hit the intercom. "This is private property," I said, my voice amplified through the speaker. Please leave. A flurry of motion outside. My mother leaned toward the camera, squinting. Faith, sweetheart, don't be silly, it's freezing out here. Open the door, we brought lunch. Lunch. As if a sandwich could undo decades of neglect. Mom, you're not invited here, I said. You need to go. My father's voice cut through hers, cold and practiced. Evelyn, stop this nonsense. You're overreacting. We came to help you get settled. Settled, I repeated. I'm already settled. You're trespassing. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned to the locksmith, gesturing impatiently. I saw the man hesitate, glancing at the door, then back at my father. My mother smiled at him as if to reassure him. It's all right, she's just having one of her episodes. Episodes. The word hit me like a slap. The locksmith knelt, unpacking his tools. The sound of metal clicking echoed up through the wooden floorboards. My throat tightened. I dialed the sheriff's office. The phone rang once before a calm female voice answered. High Ridge County Dispatch, what's your emergency? My name is Evelyn Cole, I said. I'm the owner of Silverwood Retreat on Frost Hollow Road. I have a no-entry notice on file from last week. My family is currently on my property with a locksmith attempting to break in. Understood, Miss Cole, she said, instantly alert. Are you safe inside the residence? Yes, I said. The doors are locked. They're outside right now. All right, stay inside. A patrol car is on its way. Keep your phone with you. I hung up and waited. Outside, the locksmith started drilling. The whine of metal on metal sliced through the cold air. Daniel shouted something I couldn't make out. Then the drill stopped. The door was holding. Faith, my mother yelled again. You're embarrassing yourself. Let us in, for God's sake. I stood in the living room, trembling but not afraid. Angry, yes, furious in a way that felt clean and sharp. I raised my voice so they could hear through the door. I said, leave. The sheriff is on the way. There was a beat of silence followed by my father's low, venomous growl. You called the police on your own family. Yes, I said simply. I did. It was strange how powerful the words felt, like drawing a line across a map that had been redrawn 100 times and finally saying, here, this is mine. The crunch of tires came again, heavier this time. Blue and red lights flickered across the snow. My parents turned toward the road, their bodies suddenly small and uncertain. Deputy Moore stepped out of the patrol car. He was tall, middle-aged, with a calm, no-nonsense demeanor. His boots left deep prints as he walked up the porch steps. Afternoon, folks, he said evenly. What seems to be the problem? My father straightened, adjusting his coat. There's no problem, officer. This is a family matter. My daughter's locked herself inside and won't let us in. We're just trying to help. The deputy's expression didn't change. Is that right? He glanced at the locksmith's drill still resting by the door. That doesn't look like helping to me. My mother clasped her hands, playing her favorite role, the concerned parent. She's not well, officer. We're just worried. The deputy nodded slowly, then turned toward the camera by the doorbell. Miss Cole, are you inside? Yes, I said through the intercom. And I'm fine. They're trespassing. Copy that. He looked back at my parents. You folks need to leave. Now. This is outrageous, my father snapped. I have every right to see my daughter. No, sir, the deputy said, voice hardening. You have every right to leave peacefully before I cite you for attempted unlawful entry. The locksmith started packing up his tools, muttering an apology. My mother's face crumpled, half anger, half disbelief. Evelyn, you can't mean this, she pleaded. It's Christmas. We're family. I pressed the intercom again. You remember Christmas now, I said softly. That's new. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Deputy Moore stepped back and gestured toward the SUV. Time to go, folks. They hesitated, the humiliation hanging in the air like frost. Daniel muttered something to my father, who spun on his heel and stomped toward the car. Ella followed quietly, her eyes flicking to the camera by the door before looking away. My mother lingered a moment longer. Her voice was low, trembling with something darker than sadness. You've made a terrible mistake, Evelyn. You'll regret this. I didn't answer. She turned and walked down the steps, her footprints filling with snow almost instantly. When the cars disappeared down the road, the deputy waited a moment before speaking into his radio. All clear. Property secure. Then he looked up at the camera. You did the right thing, ma'am. If they come back, call immediately. Thank you, I said. He nodded once, then walked back to his cruiser. The sound of his engine faded into the distance until the only thing left was the steady hush of falling snow. I stood in the entryway, the smell of cold air and adrenaline heavy around me. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely lock the deadbolt again. When the final click sounded, the house seemed to exhale. I leaned against the door, breathing deeply. My reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar, stronger somehow. I thought of Nana's words, paper beats blood. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made me tense, but the fear that once would have broken me now only sharpened my resolve. Before bed, I opened my laptop and added a new entry to the documentation log, December 23. Family attempted forced entry with locksmith. Sheriff Moore responded. Trespass recorded on video. I uploaded the footage to a private cloud drive titled Silverwood Evidence. Then, I sat on the floor in front of the fireplace watching the flames flicker against the glass. My mother's final words replayed in my head. You'll regret this, maybe, but not tonight. Tonight the house was mine. The storm rolled in overnight. By morning the world outside was white and blinding, snow piled high against the porch railings. I woke to the soft creak of the roof and the sound of wind pressing against the glass. For a few minutes I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe around me. It was strange how safe it felt after what had happened. The memory of the patrol car's lights, my mother's voice, the locksmith's drill, it already seemed far away, like a nightmare dissolving in daylight. The fire had burned low, only glowing embers left. I pulled on a sweater and started a new log in the stove, my fingers moving automatically. Every motion was deliberate. Add kindling, adjust the damper, watch the flame catch. Small acts of control. Outside, the snow kept falling, erasing the tire tracks from yesterday. By noon, my phone buzzed. It wasn't my parents this time, it was an unknown number. I answered carefully. Miss Cole, this is Deputy Moore. Relief mixed with a flicker of dread. Good morning, Deputy. Just checking in, he said. Your case from yesterday has been filed as an official trespass incident. I also forwarded a copy of the footage to our legal department. Smart move, recording everything. I learned that from my job, I said quietly. Documentation solves everything, he chuckled. Well, it sure makes my paperwork easier. If they come back, you call immediately. Don't engage. I won't, I promised. After I hung up, I made myself a cup of peppermint tea and stood by the window. The mountain was wrapped in fog, now heavy and gray. Somewhere below, my family was probably regrouping, angry, embarrassed, plotting their next move. I knew them too well to believe this was over. At 2 o'clock, I received an email from an address I recognized instantly, Margaret Cole. The subject line read, "For the sake of peace." I hesitated before opening it. My cursor hovered over the trash icon, but curiosity won. The message was short, painfully polite. Evelyn, we're all very hurt by what happened yesterday. Your father feels you've overreacted. Daniel's wife is fragile and this stress isn't good for her, or the baby. Please understand, we were only trying to bring the family together for Christmas. We'll forgive your behavior once you calm down. Call us when you're ready to act like yourself again. Mom. I stared at it until the words blurred. The cruelty wasn't in the insults. It was in the control, the rewriting of reality. I wasn't angry. I was unstable. They weren't trespassing, they were bringing the family together. I hit forward and sent it straight to my lawyer's contact form. Then I deleted it. By sunset, the storm had passed, leaving the valley blanketed and silent. I wrapped myself in a thick blanket and sat near the window, sipping tea as the light faded. The quiet pressed in on me, not oppressive this time, but full of thought. How many years had I spent convincing myself that being left out was my fault? I had built my whole adult life around not taking up space. I'd been easy to ignore because I made it easy. Every apology, every polite smile, it had been permission. Now the boundaries were written in steel locks and legal records. When night came, I opened my laptop and started searching for lawyers in High Ridge County. Most had cheerful websites with stock photos of smiling families. One caught my eye, Sable Harper, attorney at law, specializing in property disputes and civil protection. The site was simple, clean, all gray and white text on black. Her tagline read clarity, law, boundaries. I filled out the online form attaching the police report number and a brief description of what had happened. I expected a response in a few days. Instead, my phone rang 20 minutes later. "This is Sable Harper," a calm voice said. "I just reviewed your form. You mentioned a police report, a video, and repeated boundary violations. You have those files?" "Yes," I said, startled by her efficiency. "All documented." "Good. Then we can act quickly. I'd like to meet tomorrow at 2. My office is on Main Street above the gear shop. Bring your documents, your ID, and any texts or emails." I blinked momentarily, speechless. That soon, she didn't miss a beat. Entitled "Families Move Fast, We Move Faster." The call ended before I could even thank her. The next morning I drove down the mountain early. The roads were clear but slick with ice, the kind that forced you to drive slow, careful. My breath fogged the windshield despite the heater. When I reached the town, the sun was just rising pale and pink over the snow-covered roofs. Sable's office was exactly where she said, a small suite above a hiking gear store. The hallway smelled faintly of pine cleaner and coffee. When I walked in, the first thing I noticed was the silence. No family photos, no clutter. Just clean lines, gray walls, and a desk with a single silver lamp. Sable looked up from her laptop. She was in her 40s, hair dark and sharp against her white turtleneck, eyes cool but not unkind. "Evelyn Cole," she said, extending a hand. "You've had a week." "That's one word for it," I replied. She gestured to the chair opposite her. "Show me what you've got." I handed her the folder, printouts of text screenshots, the police report, a flash drive with the video footage. She scanned through them quickly, methodical and calm. When she finished, she set the papers down and folded her hands. "This isn't uncommon," she said. "Blood doesn't like boundaries. But you've done the right thing, quiet, documented, unemotional. That makes you dangerous." I let out a shaky laugh. "I've never been called dangerous before." "You are now." She pulled a clean sheet of paper toward her. "Here's what we'll do. First, we'll file a formal no trespass letter with the county sheriff's office. That makes it legal. Second, we'll notify your family in writing that any future attempts to access the property or contact you directly will be considered harassment. Third, we'll lock down the paperwork around your LLC and title. They can't claim ownership of what they can't see." The speed of it all was dizzying. "You think they'll stop?" Her eyes met mine. "People like this don't stop because you ask nicely. They stop when there are consequences." When the meeting ended, she handed me a copy of the draft letter. "Read it before you sign. Every word matters, especially the first one." I looked at the bold black text at the top of the page. "Notice of no trespass, Silverwood Retreat property of Silverwood Holdings LLC." It wasn't just a legal form, it was a declaration. Driving back up the mountain, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The fear was still there, but it had shape now. It was something I could handle. When I reached the cabin, I lit the fire again and set the signed letter on the table. Tomorrow it would go to the sheriff's office. Tomorrow the law would have my back. I stood at the window looking out at the snow. The valley was quiet but not empty anymore. It was waiting. So was I. By the time I reached the sheriff's office the next morning, the world outside was still frozen in that half-light between night and day. The sky was pale gray, the kind of color that promises snow but doesn't deliver. My boots squeaked on the polished floor as I stepped inside, clutching the manila folder Sable had given me. The deputy at the front desk recognized me instantly. "Miss Cole," he said, offering a polite nod. "You back for follow-up?" "Yes," I said. My attorney prepared the no trespass letter. I was told to file it here directly. He took the papers, scanned them quickly, then whistled low under his breath. "She doesn't waste time, does she? Harper's one of the sharp ones." "That's why I hired her," I replied. He disappeared into a back room. When he returned, he had a clipboard with 2 stamps, one blue, one red. He pressed them firmly at the bottom of the page, the ink spreading through the paper. "There," he said. "Filed, recorded, and copied. Anyone who sets foot on that property uninvited is now officially trespassing under county code." Something in me loosened. It wasn't joy exactly, more like a deep exhale I'd been holding for years. When I stepped outside, snow had begun to fall again. I stood there on the steps for a moment, watching the flakes drift down. For once, they didn't remind me of silence or absence. They reminded me of defense. Back at the cabin, I spent the afternoon in motion. It wasn't panic this time, it was preparation. I checked the locks, replaced the batteries in the outdoor cameras, and moved the router so the Wi-Fi signal reached every corner of the house. By 4 o'clock, my phone pinged with a new message from Sable. "Letter filed successfully. Next step: documentation of physical security. Install at least 2 visible cameras. People like them respect surveillance more than boundaries." I smiled faintly. She wasn't wrong. By dusk, I had mounted an additional camera at the end of the driveway, its small red light blinking against the snow. I walked back to the porch, dusting off my gloves. Inside, the house felt warmer, steadier, like it was finally cooperating with me. That night, as the fire cracked and popped, I decided to post a photo on my private Instagram. The one with only 6 followers, my friends from work, and Nana May. The picture was simple. The deck lights glowing in the snow, a cup of tea steaming beside the railing. I wrote a short caption beneath it. "Peace looks like this." For a few hours it felt true. The next morning I woke to my phone vibrating endlessly. At first, I thought it was another storm alert. Then, I saw the name of the group chat I hadn't opened in months, Cole Family Updates. My pulse spiked. They'd found the post. The chat was a flurry of messages, mostly from my mother. Screenshots of my photo had been pasted into the thread, followed by her all-too-familiar tone of false cheer. "So exciting, everyone. Evelyn bought a winter resort. Perfect timing, Daniel and Ella will move in after Christmas. The baby needs space and clean mountain air." My aunt had replied with emojis of hearts. A cousin chimed in. "That place looks amazing." Then Daniel himself added a single message. A photo of stacked boxes labeled nursery and kitchen. My throat went dry. Then came the text that made everything tilt. From my mother directly to me, private this time. "Evelyn, I'm so glad we're all on the same page now. It's such a relief. We'll handle groceries. Expect us by Friday. Non-negotiable. Non-negotiable." Like she was assigning me a task. Like this house, the one I built with my own money, my own blood and exhaustion, was another branch of her kingdom. I didn't answer right away. I just sat there, staring at the words until the letters blurred. My hands were trembling, but not with fear, with focus. I opened a new email. The subject line was "Emergency Follow-Up, Harper Legal." I attached screenshots of every message, including Daniel's photo. I wrote a single line beneath. "They are planning to return. Please advise." The reply came within minutes. "Understood. Do not engage. We file the motion today. Make sure your cameras are recording continuously. I'll handle the rest." It was the most reassuring sentence I'd ever read. Still, the air in the cabin had changed. The quiet no longer felt like peace. It felt like a held breath. Around lunchtime, I walked out onto the deck, the snow creaking beneath my boots. The valley stretched out below, vast and white, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Maybe it was paranoia, or maybe it was experience. I stood there until the cold stung my face. Then I went inside and began to write. Not an email, not a log, something different. A letter addressed not to the sheriff or Sable, but to myself. Dear Evelyn, it began. You did not imagine it. You were not difficult. You were erased, and now you are writing yourself back in. I didn't know why I wrote it, only that it felt necessary. I sealed it in an envelope and tucked it into the top drawer of my desk. A reminder, a record. At sunset, the camera app buzzed. For a heartbeat, I thought they'd come early, but it was just a deer crossing the driveway, its body, a dark shape against the snow. I laughed quietly at my own tension. Still, I went through my nightly ritual, double-checking doors, turning on the porch lights, locking every window latch. The house clicked and sighed as it settled. Before bed, I called Nana. She answered on the second ring. "Hi, honey," she said, voice raspy but steady. "You sound tired." "I'm fine," I said. "Mom's planning another invasion." A pause. Then, "Of course she is. That woman couldn't take no if you embroidered it on a pillow." That made me laugh, really laugh. The kind that cracked something open. She texted me, "Non-negotiable," I said. "Then negotiate with silence," Nana replied. "That's the only language she doesn't speak." When we hung up, I sat there a while, listening to the faint hum of the heater and the whisper of wind against the glass. Silence. My own kind. Before sleeping, I opened my phone one last time. A new notification blinked, an email from Sable marked filed and recorded. The protective order was officially active. For the first time in days, I didn't dream about locks or drills or the echo of my mother's voice. I dreamed of nothing at all. When I woke, the world outside was blindingly bright, sunlight striking the snow in 1,000 shards. The mountain looked untouched, eternal. I stood at the window and whispered the words that had been circling in my mind since this all began. Paper beats blood. And this time, I believed it. They didn't drive up the mountain this time. They sent paperwork. The envelope arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, slipped neatly into my mailbox between a grocery flyer and an electric bill. I didn't recognize the return address until I saw the words Cole and Reinhardt LLP. My stomach turned to ice. I carried it inside like it was something radioactive, setting it on the counter next to my half-finished cup of coffee. The paper was heavy, the kind used for wedding invitations and lawsuits. I slid it open with the edge of a knife and unfolded the first page. Notice of family mediation. The second page was worse, request for guardianship review. I read the words twice, then again. It was written in that same faux-kind legal language my father loved, phrases like acting in the best interest of family harmony and concerns regarding emotional stability. My name appeared at least 10 times, followed by carefully chosen adjectives: isolated, uncooperative, erratic. My hands started shaking. They weren't trying to get into my house anymore. They were trying to get into my head. When the phone rang, I flinched. It was my Aunt Melinda, her voice syrupy with false sympathy. "Evie, honey, I just heard from your mother. She says you've been under a lot of stress up there all alone. Everyone's worried." "Worried?" I asked. My voice came out thin and sharp. "Is that what we're calling it now?" "She just wants to make sure you're okay, dear. Maybe let them visit, ease the tension before this gets ugly." "Before this gets ugly," I repeated. "They filed for guardianship." Silence. Then awkwardly, "Well, you know your mother. She means well." I hung up before she could finish. The moment the line went dead, I pressed my palms against the countertop until the shaking stopped. Then I picked up my phone and called Sable. She answered on the first ring. "Cole, family escalation." "Yes," I said. "A letter. Guardianship. Mediation. They're calling me unstable." "Bring it to me," she said. "Right now." When I arrived at her office, the snow had turned to rain and the world felt gray and heavy. Sable was at her desk, her dark hair pulled into a low knot, her expression unreadable. I handed her the letter. She read it silently, her eyes moving fast. When she finished, she sat back and let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "They're creative, I'll give them that," she said. "They're trying to preemptively discredit you. It's not about guardianship. It's about narrative. They're building a case that you're irrational, so that every future action you take looks emotional instead of factual. So what do? I asked. Sable leaned forward. You stay factual. That's what they fear most. They're trying to provoke you into an emotional response that they can use later. I'm angry, I said quietly. Is that emotional enough? She smiled faintly. Righteous anger is still rational. Let's use it. We spent the next hour drafting a formal cease and desist, family defamation clause. It was cold, surgical, and perfect. It listed every instance of their manipulation, every false claim, every text that could be construed as harassment. It concluded with a single line: all future contact must occur through legal counsel only. When she printed it, the air between us seemed to crackle with something close to satisfaction. They're going to hate this, Sable said. Good, I replied. By the time I got back home, dusk had fallen. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that hums with unspoken thoughts. I poured a glass of wine and opened my laptop, scrolling aimlessly. I shouldn't have checked social media, but I did. And there it was. My mother's post public for everyone to see. A soft focus photo of our family from years ago, me, Daniel, and my parents, all smiling in front of the old house. The caption read, "Sometimes helping someone means making hard choices, praying for peace and understanding this Christmas." The comments were exactly what she wanted. Stay strong, Margaret. You're such a good mother. Hope your daughter gets the help she needs. I stared at the screen until my eyes blurred, then typed one comment under the post. Just one small key emoji. Then I took a screenshot, closed the app, and poured the rest of the wine down the sink. The next morning, my phone buzzed. It was Nana May. They're telling people you've lost your mind, Evie, she said without preamble. Maybe I did, I said. The day I stopped letting them control it, Nana snorted. Good. Let them choke on that. But don't let them turn this into gossip. You fight them where it hurts their reputation. I'm already there, I said. She was silent for a beat, then softer. I'm proud of you, you know. I'm proud of me too, I said, and meant it. That afternoon, I went through the motions of my new routine, logging evidence, labeling screenshots, making digital copies. But this time, something inside me shifted. It wasn't fear anymore. It was clarity. I printed out every document, even the ugliest ones, and organized them into a binder. When I slipped the final sheet into its sleeve, I caught my reflection in the window. I looked tired, yes, but not fragile. They'd spent a lifetime teaching me that quiet meant weakness. But quiet could be strategic. Quiet could be power. That night I took another step. I drafted a personal statement, not for the court, not for the lawyer, for me. A record of truth. My name is Evelyn Cole. I am of sound mind and sound boundaries. I am not unstable. I am uninterested in surrendering my home, my voice, or my peace for the sake of anyone else's comfort. I printed it and taped it to the inside of my office door next to the framed copy of my property deed. At 8:30, the phone rang again. A different number this time. Miss Cole, this is the High Ridge Court Clerk. I'm calling to confirm receipt of the defamation filing from Harper Legal. You'll receive your stamped copy by tomorrow. Thank you, I said, my voice steady. After the call, I stood at the window again. The snow had stopped, but the clouds hung low and heavy, like the sky was waiting for something. Maybe I was, too. My phone buzzed one more time before bed, another email, this one from Cole and Reinhardt. The subject line read, Notice of Property Review Request. I clicked it open and read the single sentence aloud. Our clients intend to visit Silverwood Retreat in person to resolve this matter amicably. I let out a long, tired breath and closed the laptop. They're coming, I whispered to myself, staring at the dark glass of the window. My reflection stared back, pale and resolute. I turned off the lights and locked the door. The sound of the deadbolt sliding home was steady and final. Let them come. I was ready now. They didn't knock this time. They arrived with a lawyer and a smile. The sound of tires crunching up the drive reached me before I saw them. It was a brittle winter afternoon sunlight glinting off the snow like shards of glass. I stood at the window, coffee cooling in my hand, and watched the two black SUVs crawl toward the house. The first one stopped in front of the porch, and the doors opened in perfect choreography. My father stepped out first, tall and immaculate in his wool coat. Behind him came my mother wearing her favorite red scarf, the one she used to pose in for family Christmas photos. Daniel followed, eyes hidden behind sunglasses despite the gray light. And trailing behind them, a man in a navy suit carrying a leather briefcase. The lawyer. For a long second, none of us moved. Then my father started up the steps with his usual confidence, his breath puffing out in white clouds. I didn't open the door. I only switched on the interior camera and pressed record. When the knock came, it wasn't hesitant, it was command. 3 sharp raps that echoed through the cabin. I took one slow breath before opening the door halfway. Evelyn, my father said, his tone practiced and civil. We're here under good faith. Mr. Lawrence, our attorney, has advised we handle this privately. Behind him, my mother smiled like she was greeting a guest. Sweetheart, please, it's freezing. Let's just come in and talk. I held the door where it was. Talk about what your ongoing trespassing or the forged legal requests you've been sending. Mr. Lawrence stepped forward, calm and oily. Miss Cole, I represent your family in what we hope will be a reconciliation process. Everyone here simply wants a resolution. I already have one, I said. It's called a protective order. My father's jaw flexed. You don't need lawyers and police to deal with your own family. I needed them because of my family, I said. For a moment, his expression cracked, revealing something cold beneath the civility. Then he gestured to the lawyer. We just want to discuss shared use of the property. You've created unnecessary hostility. Shared use, I repeated. That's a creative phrase for breaking and entering. The lawyer raised a hand in mild protest. No one here wishes to escalate things. We understand you're upset. But given the financial and emotional investment your parents have made in your success, they have reason to believe the property constitutes partial family equity. I laughed. The sound startled even me. You mean they bought me Christmas presents as a kid, so now they own my land? Mr. Lawrence's polite smile faltered. Our position is that the property should serve the family collectively, especially considering your brother's circumstances. Daniel finally spoke, his voice sharp. You've got 3 bedrooms, Evie. You don't even use them. I use all of them, I said. They hold something called peace. My mother's eyes filled with rehearsed tears. You're making this harder than it has to be. No, I said quietly. You did that years ago. The wind shifted, sweeping snow across the porch. The lawyer cleared his throat, trying to regain control. Perhaps we can move inside. It's rather cold. Not a chance, I said. But if you'd like warmth, I can call my attorney. She's quite good at generating legal heat. For the first time, their expressions flickered. I stepped back just enough to grab my phone and pressed the video call button. When Sable's face appeared on the screen, calm and poised, I turned it toward them. Everyone, this is my attorney, Miss Harper, I said. You might remember her name from the paperwork you received. Sable's voice came through the speaker, crisp as snow. Good afternoon, Mr. Lawrence. I assume you've reviewed the active no trespass order and the pending motion regarding attempted property fraud. Mr. Lawrence blinked. I'm aware of certain documents, yes. Then I suggest you review them again, Sable said. My client is under court protection. You're currently violating that order by standing on her porch. This conversation is being recorded both by her and now by me. My father's composure cracked first. This is absurd, he snapped. You can't record us without consent. You're on private property, Sable replied smoothly. Consent isn't required when documenting criminal trespass. For once, he had no answer. The lawyer murmured something low to my father. My mother's eyes darted from me to the camera, realization dawning that their performance was collapsing. Daniel shifted his weight, angry and restless. "You're not the victim here, Evie," he said. "You're just a selfish brat with a mountain and a martyr complex." I met his stare evenly. If protecting myself makes me selfish, then yes, I'll take that over being complicit. The lawyer sighed, closing his briefcase with a click. "This discussion is clearly unproductive. We'll revisit through official channels." "Excellent," I said. "Direct all further communication to Miss Harper's office. You're done here." They turned to leave, but my father paused at the top of the steps. "This isn't over," he said softly. "I know," I replied. "That's why I have cameras." He walked to the SUV without another word. My mother lingered a moment longer, her face tight and trembling. "You've destroyed this family," she whispered. "No," I said. "I just stopped letting it destroy me." She flinched like I'd struck her, then turned away. Snow swirled around her as she joined the others, and within minutes both cars disappeared down the road. The silence that followed felt enormous. I stood on the porch, watching the last swirl of exhaust fade into the trees. Then I closed the door, locked it, and leaned against it, shaking with adrenaline. Inside, the air was warm and still. My phone buzzed. A new message from Sable. "They'll try something else. They always do. Stay steady." I set the phone down and walked to the living room. The flames in the fireplace flickered, low, painting soft light across the walls. My reflection shimmered faintly in the window, small but upright, finally unafraid. For the first time I realized I wasn't just surviving this. I was winning. I poured myself a cup of tea, sat by the fire, and let the heat sink into my hands. The cabin no longer felt like a retreat. It felt like a fortress, one built on every no I'd never been allowed to say. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and relentless. Somewhere beyond the pines, my family was regrouping, licking their wounds, plotting their next move. But I wasn't scared anymore. I'd faced them on my doorstep and held my ground. And if they came back, I'd be ready with law, with proof, and with silence, sharper than any weapon they'd ever used. The storm would come again. But now, I knew how to stand through it. They left my house in silence, but they didn't leave me alone. A week after the confrontation, I thought the snow might have buried them for good. The mountain roads were nearly impassable. The town quiet, the only sound, the soft hum of wind moving through the trees. I started sleeping again, deeper each night, the kind of rest I hadn't known in years. I'd even let myself believe it was over until the mail arrived. 5 thick envelopes waited inside my box, each one stamped with a law firm's insignia and the county court's seal. The sight of them made my chest tighten. I carried them inside, sat at the kitchen table, and laid them out in a neat line like evidence. My hands felt cold even though the fire was going. The first envelope was labeled Notice of Property Review. The second, Family Petition for Shared Ownership. The third, Mental Health Evaluation Request. By the fourth, my eyes were burning. Every document was some twisted reinvention of reality, written in the clean, detached language of bureaucracy. According to my parents' lawyer, my isolated lifestyle raised concerns about capacity to maintain property of significant value. They were questioning my sanity again, this time on record. Daniel's affidavit claimed that he'd contributed to Silverwood's renovations through emotional and logistical support. I almost laughed. The only thing he'd ever lifted in this house was his own ego. I kept reading until the words began to blur. The phrases repeated like a hymn, concerned, unwell, erratic. By the time I reached the last page, my pulse was pounding in my ears. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the mess of papers, the snow reflecting light through the window behind me. I wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, I felt something steadier rising beneath the exhaustion. I picked up my pen and started writing on a yellow legal pad, date received. Source. Summary. My handwriting was slow, deliberate. Every word I wrote felt like reclaiming a breath they'd tried to steal. By noon, I'd cataloged everything, scanned every page, and saved digital copies in 3 separate folders. One for Sable, one for the sheriff, and one for me. When the anger finally came, it wasn't loud. It was quiet and sharp like a knife sliding home. I called Sable's office. She answered after 2 rings, her tone brisk but not unkind. "I assume you've received their counterattack," she said. 5 envelopes. "They're calling me unstable and demanding a review of the property's ownership." "Classic overreach," Sable replied. "They're trying to drown you in paper, but we'll respond to each one. Calmly, precisely, and publicly." She began outlining steps, counterclaims, verifications notices. Her voice steadied me the way only competence can. "We'll file for defamation and harassment," she said. "We'll attach every text, every message, every false statement. Their lawyer will regret ever drafting these." When we hung up, I sat in the stillness, staring at the piles of paper that had once terrified me. They didn't look powerful anymore, they just looked desperate. By afternoon, I decided to leave the cabin for the first time in days. I needed groceries and fresh air. The town was quiet, the snow on the main street turned to slush under passing trucks. At the general store, I noticed how people looked at me, curious, cautious, then kind. The woman behind the counter, Sarah, smiled as she bagged my items. "You're the one up at Silverwood, right?" she said. "Don't let the rumors bother you. Small towns love a story." I blinked, surprised. "You've heard things." "Oh, honey, everyone has. But from what I hear, you're the one standing your ground." That simple sentence loosened something inside me. I smiled back. "Trying my best." "Good," she said. "The town could use a little backbone." When I got back to the cabin, the sunset had turned the snow pale pink. I made tea, lit the fire, and tried to pretend things were normal, but the peace didn't last. That night I checked my phone and saw the next assault. My mother had posted a new message on Facebook, a photo of a snow-covered cabin that looked eerily like mine, captioned, "Praying for my daughter this Christmas. Sometimes love means doing what's hard." The comments were predictable. "Stay strong, Margaret. You're such a good mom. She'll thank you someday." I felt the familiar heat of humiliation rise in my throat. Before I could talk myself out of it, I screenshotted everything and sent it to Sable. Within minutes, she replied, "Save the originals. This counts as defamation. They're building our case for us." I closed my phone, the fury cooling into focus. The next morning, Sable called. "I've filed the defamation counterclaim," she said. "Now we go on offense. But remember, you need to protect your energy. They'll come at you from every angle." I exhaled. "I'm tired, but I'm fine." "Tired isn't defeat," she said. "It's just the cost of standing up." After the call, I took a walk down the path that led toward the ridge. The air was so cold it stung my lungs, but I kept going until I could see the whole valley spread below me. For a long moment, I just stood there, letting the silence sink in. The weight of their control, their years of rewriting me, was finally lifting. I realized that I wasn't afraid of being alone anymore. I was afraid of ever being under them again. Back inside, I sat at my desk and wrote another letter, this one to myself, like the first. They can use paper to wound you, but you can use it to heal. Every signature, every stamp, every page with your name spelled correctly. It's proof you exist on your own terms. That night, the snow fell again, soft and relentless. I was washing dishes when the phone buzzed, a notification from the driveway camera. My heart jumped, but when I opened the app, it was just a fox trotting across the snow. I laughed softly, setting down the plate. For once, the night felt calm. The next morning, a different kind of message waited in my inbox, a short formal note from Sable. "All filings received. Court has acknowledged your countersuit." Their narrative is collapsing. It didn't feel like triumph exactly, but it felt like air after drowning. I made breakfast, humming quietly, and when I sat down with my tea, I noticed the light on the snow outside, clean, clear, unbroken. The house was still. Then my phone buzzed again, one last time before noon. It wasn't Sable or the sheriff. It was her, my mother. "You've gone too far, Evelyn. But don't worry, we'll handle this in person." I stared at the screen until my reflection blurred in the glass. I could almost hear her voice behind the words, sweet and poisonous. The mountain around me was silent, but I knew what was coming. The paper war was ending. The physical one was about to begin. Outside, the wind picked up scattering snow off the pines like a warning. I looked toward the valley and whispered to myself, "Let them come." This time I wouldn't be waiting in fear. This time I'd be waiting with proof. The first sign wasn't a car engine, it was the motion sensor. The alert went off at 9:47 p.m., a sharp tone that sliced through the quiet of the cabin. I was reading by the fire, the kind of peace that doesn't last long when you're a coal. The phone vibrated again. Motion detected gate camera. Multiple vehicles. I set the book down and stood, my pulse quickening. Outside, the snow was falling, hard fat flakes catching the reflection of the porch light. Through the frosted window, I saw beams of headlights cutting across the trees, weaving their way up the road. 2 black SUVs. The same pair as before. My hand hovered over my phone. I already knew who to call. The sheriff's direct number was saved as a favorite. I pressed it, my voice steady, when the dispatcher answered. "This is Evelyn Cole. Silverwood Retreat, parcel 482B. The trespassers are back. 2 vehicles, 4 occupants minimum. You have the order on file. Copy that, miss." Cole, the dispatcher said. "Deputy Miller is on duty. He's en route." "Thank you," I said and hung up. I turned off all the interior lights, leaving only the fire to cast a low glow across the living room. The house fell into a hushed darkness. I moved to the security panel and checked the camera feed. The SUVs had stopped halfway up the drive. The doors opened, and 4 silhouettes stepped out: my father, my mother Daniel, and a man I didn't recognize. They stood in the snow, arguing among themselves. Then slowly they began walking toward the porch. I zoomed in. The 4th man was carrying a metal case, a locksmith. Again, I didn't move. I let them reach the first step before I spoke through the speaker. "This is private property," I said, my voice clear through the doorbell system. "You are trespassing under an active protective order. Leave now or law enforcement will intervene." My mother's voice came back, muffled but sharp with outrage. "Evelyn, don't you dare talk to me like I'm a stranger. Open this door right now." I didn't reply. My father took over, his tone cold and businesslike. "You are obstructing family access to shared assets. We have documentation." He lifted a sheet of paper toward the camera, but the snow caught it and tore it from his hands. It fluttered away into the dark. The irony almost made me laugh. "Documentation," I said through the speaker. "That's cute. You'll need it when the deputy arrives." The locksmith hesitated, glancing between them. "Sir," he said quietly, "if there's a protective order, do your job," my father snapped. Before he could reply, the siren broke through the snow, distant but rising fast. A flash of red and blue light painted the trees. The figures on my porch froze. Within seconds, the sheriff's cruiser slid to a stop at the edge of the drive. Deputy Miller stepped out, his flashlight cutting a clean beam through the falling snow. "Evening, folks," he called, voice calm but firm. "I'd advise you to step off that porch." My father straightened, every inch of his authority summoned for one last performance. "Officer, this is a family matter. You have no right to—" "You're correct," Miller interrupted. "I don't have a right, I have an order." He held up a folder sealed in a plastic sleeve. "Filed last month, reaffirmed by the court this morning. Names Gregory Cole, Margaret Cole, and Daniel Cole. You are formally prohibited from entering or attempting to enter this property." The snow seemed to swallow the silence that followed. My mother's mouth fell open. Daniel's jaw tightened. The locksmith slowly backed down the steps, muttering an apology. "This is outrageous," my father said. "We're her family." "Not relevant," Miller said. "You're trespassers tonight." I watched through the camera as he gestured toward their cars. "I'm going to escort you down the road. You can collect your belongings tomorrow under supervision if the court allows it." "You can't do this," Daniel hissed. "I can," Miller said evenly. "And I will. Get moving." For a moment I thought my father would argue. But then he saw the deputy's hand resting lightly on his holster, not a threat, just a reminder. Slowly, stiffly, my father turned and started walking back to the SUV. My mother followed, clutching her scarf like a shield. Daniel lingered for half a second, glaring at the camera. "This isn't over, Evie," he said, voice low and sharp. "You think this is strength. It's just isolation." "Then I'll take isolation," I said softly, though he couldn't hear it. They got into the vehicles and turned around, the headlights sweeping across the trees one last time before disappearing down the mountain road. The deputy waited until they were gone, then walked up to the door and looked straight into the camera. "All clear, Miss Cole. Call if they return." "Thank you," I said, into the mic. He nodded once and left his cruiser lights fading into the dark. For a long time I didn't move. I just stood there listening to the sound of the wind pressing against the windows. Then I sank down onto the sofa, my hands trembling not from fear, but from the sheer weight of release. It was over. For now. I stared at the flames, watching them shift and twist. There was a strange emptiness where panic used to be replaced by something heavier but cleaner. Power, maybe. Or peace. I got up and poured myself a glass of water, the silence around me thick and absolute. When I turned back toward the window, I noticed something half buried in the snow at the base of the porch, steps, a crumpled sheet of paper. I hesitated, then opened the door and stepped outside, the cold biting through my sweater. The air was sharp and still. I crouched down, picked up the paper, and smoothed it out under the porch light. It was the document my father had waved earlier, soaked through and streaked with mud. The text was barely legible, but I could make out the words "temporary family lease agreement" and beneath it a shaky signature, mine, forged again. I almost smiled. They hadn't learned. Back inside, I dried the paper carefully and added it to my folder of evidence. My collection of ghosts, each one proof of how far they'd go to control me. Later that night, I called Sable, told her everything. She listened quietly, then said, "They're running out of tactics. Forgery, trespass, harassment. It's a pattern of desperation. I'll file a supplemental report first thing tomorrow." "Will it ever stop?" I asked. "Yes," she said, "when they realize the story has changed. You're not the silent one anymore. You're the author." After the call, I sat on the floor beside the fire, letting her words settle in. Author. It felt strange and right. For years, they'd written my part for me, the overlooked daughter, the compliant peacekeeper, the easy scapegoat. But now the script was mine. I looked around the cabin, the polished wood floors, the glowing deck lights, outside the framed property deed on the wall. Every inch of it was a sentence in my story, written in my language. Before going to bed, I opened the window just an inch. Cold air drifted in, smelling of pine and clean snow. I whispered into the quiet, "I'm still here." And for the first time in my life, the silence whispered back, "You always were." The snow melted slower that week, as if even the mountain wanted time to breathe after everything that had happened. For the first time in months, I didn't wake to the sound of alerts or pounding heartbeats. I woke to birdsong, quiet, hesitant, as if testing the air. The sun rose pale and gold through the window, catching in the glass beams. I lay there for a long while, listening to the house creak, the wood settling under the heat. It sounded like contentment. That morning, I brewed coffee and sat at the dining table, my laptop open, a fresh stack of documents beside me. But they weren't court filings or police reports. They were business papers, marketing proposals, design briefs, something that belonged wholly to me. I had started pitching Silverwood Retreat as a private creative residency, a place for writers and artists who needed space to think. It felt poetic, turning the fortress that once existed for defense into a sanctuary for creation. By noon, my phone buzzed. It wasn't my parents, it was Sable. Her message was simple. All filings resolved. Orders finalized. Case closed. I stared at those two words, case closed, until they stopped looking real. The tension that had sat behind my ribs for years loosened, slow and irreversible. I walked to the window, watching the wind sweep across the snow, and let out a breath that felt older than me. I thought about calling Nana first. She deserved to know. Her voice cracked with joy when she answered. "Well, it's about time they learned what consequences feel like," she said. How's the house peaceful? I said. For once. Good, she replied. Peace isn't quiet, it's earned. Don't you forget that. After we hung up, I spent the afternoon fixing small things around the cabin, the loose drawer in the kitchen, the creaky hinge in the hallway. Ordinary problems, beautiful problems. I didn't realize how much I'd missed the feeling of fixing something that stayed fixed. That night, I made dinner: roast chicken, rosemary potatoes, a glass of white wine. I ate at the table with music playing low in the background. The house smelled like lemon and garlic and wood smoke. For once, there was no weight pressing against the air. When the knock came, it wasn't loud, just one polite rap against the door. I froze. My body remembered the old rhythm of fear before my mind could catch up. But when I looked at the security feed, my chest loosened. It wasn't my family. It was the deputy. I opened the door, smiling. Evening, officer. He tipped his hat. Evening, ma'am. Just came by to give you this. He handed me an envelope. Inside was an official notice: Case No. 2491 Cole v. Cole. Closed. All claims denied. Thought you'd like the paper copy, he said. Lot of folks never get closure like this. Thank you, I said quietly. You have no idea how much that means. He smiled, small and kind. Actually, I think I do. You take care now. When he left, I closed the door and stood in the quiet, the notice heavy in my hand. I walked to the fireplace and set it on the mantel. My name, Evelyn Cole, looked clean in print. Not as a defendant, not as a resource, but as a person who'd won. Later that evening, I received an email from an unknown address. For a moment, my stomach dropped, but when I opened it, my breath caught. Faith Stewart here, Sable forwarded your story to me. She said you might be open to speaking on record about family coercion and ownership abuse for a case study I'm compiling. Your story might help others. I smiled. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had built my life around silence, and now the world wanted me to speak. I wrote back, I'll think about it. But thank you. The next morning I drove into town. The air was bright and thin, the roads clear for the first time in weeks. At the general store, Sarah waved as I came in. You missed the gossip, she said, grinning. The sheriff's report hit the papers. Whole town knows now. I'd say you're a local hero. Hero might be too strong, I said, laughing softly. Well, around here, anyone who tells entitled people no and survives counts as one. I bought coffee beans, candles, a new set of flannel sheets, mundane things, the kind that make a life feel whole. As I was leaving, I passed the notice board near the door. Among the flyers for ski rentals and church potlucks, one caught my eye. It was a photograph of a cabin in the snow nearly identical to mine, with the headline Winter Writers Residency Applications Open. Someone had copied my idea. But instead of irritation, I felt a strange pride. Maybe peace spreads the way conflict does, quietly, one act of defiance at a time. When I got home, I printed the finalized deed and pinned it to the corkboard in my office. Beneath it, I taped a single sentence I'd written the night before. They taught me silence, but I turned it into strength. I spent the afternoon working on my new project, a branding campaign for a mental health foundation. As I wrote copy about recovery and identity, I realized how much of my life had mirrored the words I now use to help others. That evening, I walked onto the deck. The air was cold enough to bite, but I didn't mind. Below me, the valley stretched endless and blue. I thought about all the Decembers I'd spent waiting for a call, a message, an invitation that never came. And now, standing there, I understood something simple and devastating. I'd never really been waiting for them. I'd been waiting for myself to believe I was allowed to exist without permission. Inside, my phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. My instinct clenched, but when I opened it, I exhaled. It was Belle Daniels' wife. I just wanted to say thank you. You probably saved me too. We moved. I filed for divorce. I hope you're free now, the way I want to be. For a long moment, I couldn't move. Then I typed back, you deserve peace, Belle. Take it, and don't look back. When I hit send, I realized I was crying, not the sharp, frightened kind of tears, but the kind that come when something finally ends. The next morning, I set up a new camera on the deck, not for security, but for beauty. I started taking photos of the sunrise, the frost on the railing, the first thaw of spring creeping down the ridge. Each picture was a reminder the mountain still held me, but it no longer confined me. By sunset, I sat on the steps wrapped in a blanket, a mug of peppermint tea warming my hands. The light shifted gold to rose to blue. Somewhere below, a fox moved through the trees, leaving a single trail of paw prints across the untouched snow. For once, I didn't think about who might be watching. I just let the silence wrap around me, the same silence I had fought for, and finally learned to love. Tomorrow I would start again. A new season, a new version of me. But tonight, under the dim glow of the deck lights, I finally whispered the truth I had spent my whole life earning. I'm home. The first snow of December came early that year. It drifted down in slow, lazy spirals outside my window, gathering softly on the deck railing and the roof of the old pine shed. The world was white and quiet again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was gentle. The silence no longer pressed against my ribs, it wrapped around me like a blanket. A year had passed since that night, when the sheriff's car lights had painted the snow red and blue, when my family's voices had finally faded into the dark. Since then, everything had changed, and yet in the most comforting way, everything had stayed still. I stood by the same fireplace that once burned for protection. Now it burned for warmth. My house was no longer a fortress, it was alive. There were candles flickering on the mantel, the scent of pine and cinnamon in the air, and faint laughter echoing from the kitchen. This Christmas wasn't empty, it was full. Priya was pouring cocoa into mismatched mugs. Gabe was arguing with Luce over which Christmas playlist to play, and Sarah and Tom, my neighbors from down the ridge, were arranging cinnamon rolls on a platter. The cabin, once a sanctuary for one, had become a gathering place, a home. I set the last string of lights along the window frame, stepping back to look at the glow. The reflection in the glass caught my own face, still calm but softer than before. I smiled. For years I had tried to earn my family's invitation. I'd built a life around the ache of exclusion. Now I realized I'd never needed to be invited at all. When everyone settled with mugs in hand, I went to the deck door. "You have to see this," I said. The group followed me outside, stepping carefully into the snow. The air was sharp and bright, the night sky, a deep blue scattered with stars. Below, the valley shimmered with frost. "This place is magic," Priya whispered, breath visible in the cold. "It's peace," I said quietly. "The real kind, the kind no one can take from you." They fell silent, and for a moment we all just stood there, breathing in the mountain air. I could feel the past like a ghost behind me, the years of being overlooked, erased, minimized, but it didn't hurt anymore. The pain had become a landmark, not a prison. Later, after dinner, I sat by the fire with my notebook. It wasn't filled with court filings or family arguments anymore. It held plans, ideas for the future of Silverwood. The retreat would open in spring, hosting writers, artists, women who needed somewhere quiet to rebuild. I wanted this place to be more than my story. I wanted it to be a refuge for others who had once been told they didn't belong. As I wrote, Sarah came to sit beside me. "You did something brave," she said. "Most people run from the kind of hurt you went through. You built something out of it." I looked into the flames. "Maybe that's what revenge really is," I said. "Not payback. Just peace. Peace they can't touch." We sat there for a while, the fire crackling softly. Somewhere in the background, the radio began playing an old carol. It wasn't the kind my parents used to play during those perfect photo-ready Christmases. It was slower, a little sad, and somehow more honest. When the clock chimed 10, I walked to the window. The snow was falling again, thick and slow. I pressed my hand to the glass. The valley below was blanketed in white, the lights from nearby houses glowing faintly like candles in the dark. I thought of them, my parents, my brother, somewhere far away now, still locked in their own story, still rewriting the truth to make it hurt less. For the first time, I didn't feel anger, only distance, only peace. The next morning, I found an envelope in the mailbox, the handwriting unmistakable, my father's. I stood there for a long time before opening it. Inside was a single page. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a letter. It was a legal transfer notice confirming the sale of their old house in Connecticut. A final severing of ties. No words, no signature beyond the required one. I laughed softly. Of course, I whispered. Even their goodbye had to come with paperwork. But it didn't sting. Not anymore. It felt like the last page of a chapter I'd already finished reading. That night I hosted a small dinner for my guests, the table filled with laughter and warmth. We clinked glasses to new beginnings, to found families, to the kind of peace you have to build with your own hands. When everyone left, I stood by the door, watching their taillights fade into the trees. Then I turned off the main lights and walked out to the deck one last time. The snow glittered beneath the moonlight, untouched and endless. I flipped the switch that controlled the string of deck lights, the same ones I had hung that first night when I thought the house would only ever be mine. They glowed softly against the dark. I whispered Merry Christmas, not to anyone specific, but to the air, to the silence, to the girl I used to be who thought peace was something she had to earn. The wind rustled through the pines like a sigh. I took a long sip of peppermint tea, the warmth steady in my hands. It wasn't the ending I imagined. It was better. I no longer wanted revenge. I wanted light. And I had it. If you've ever been the one they forgot, if you've ever been the quiet person in a loud family, I hope this story finds you. I hope you know you're not invisible. You're just meant to shine somewhere else. Tell me, what does home mean to you? Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your story. And if this one stayed with you, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay with me for more stories like this. Stories about finding peace, claiming your voice, and remembering your worth. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't fury, it's freedom.